The water below was the color of a bruise. Lieutenant Commander Derek Callahan had flown over the North Atlantic in winter before. He knew what it looked like: iron-gray swells, broken ice plates grinding against each other like tectonic plates in slow motion, the kind of cold that didn't feel like temperature so much as a physical force pushing through the fuselage walls. He knew this water. He respected it. But the shape drifting 200 feet below the MH-60 Sierra wasn't something he expected. "Bank left," he said into the headset. 15 degrees. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Voss adjusted without asking why. After 11 years flying alongside Callahan, he'd learned that when the lieutenant commander used that particular tone flat, stripped of inflection, something was wrong. Not operationally wrong, just wrong. The shape resolved as they descended. A person, face down, half submerged on a fragment of debris, wooden planking, maybe, or part of a hull panel. Hard to tell from this altitude. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't waving, wasn't doing anything a living person would do when a military helicopter came within earshot. "I've got a body," said Petty Officer First Class Grant Holloway from the rescue hoist station. His voice was careful. Professionals didn't say corpse until they were certain. "Female, looks like. Prone position. Get a downwash reading," Callahan said. The number came back. -11 Celsius at surface level. Wind chill factored it lower. 3 days of exposure to that. And they knew from the distress ping that had gone cold 72 hours ago that there had been a vessel in this grid, should have produced a corpse. They descended anyway. Holloway went down on the hoist cable with the standard rescue swimmer kit. The rotor wash blasted the surface into white noise. He landed 6 feet from the figure, lost his footing for a moment on the unstable debris, then regained it and moved in. The radio crackled. "She's breathing." No one on the helicopter said anything for a moment. "Say again," Callahan said. "Breathing. Weak, but a pause. Sir, she's got her arms around a rifle, both hands, full grip." That was the first thing. The second thing came when Holloway tried to secure her for extraction. He'd done this 100 times, injured civilians, downed pilots, sailors pulled from the water in every condition from mild hypothermia to near death. The protocol was standard. You got an arm under them. You clipped the harness. You kept their head above the wind. She moved before he touched her. Not a panic reflex. Not the disoriented thrashing of someone barely conscious. Her left arm swung out in a controlled arc that caught Holloway's wrist and locked it. Her eyes opened pale blue, sharp, completely present, and she looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she let go. "She's awake," Holloway said. His voice had changed slightly. "She's aware. Copy. Get her up." The extraction took 4 minutes. Standard procedure. But Holloway reported later that she'd kept her right hand on the rifle the entire time, even when they clipped her to the hoist cable, even when the wind hit her and the cable swung. She adjusted her body to keep the weapon clear of the ocean surface. Instinctive, automatic, the kind of muscle memory that didn't care whether its owner was dying or not. When they hauled her into the helicopter and Callahan finally saw her face, his first thought was that she was young, mid-20s, maybe. Her lips were blue. Ice crystals had formed in her hair and along her collar. Her skin was the color of old paper. His second thought was that her grip on the rifle hadn't loosened even once. "Get her to the med kit," he said. They wrapped her in emergency thermal blankets. Navy Corpsman Second Class Tyler Marsh started the assessment pulse, pupils, breathing rate, core temperature. The numbers came back strange. Her core temperature was low, but not at the critical threshold. Her pulse was weak but steady, rhythmically steady, the kind of steadiness you didn't see in survivors pulled from 3 days in the North Atlantic. "Heart rate's 48, Marsh said quietly. Callahan looked at him. "She's cold," Marsh said, "but not as cold as she should be." Callahan leaned back against the fuselage wall and looked at the woman. She was unconscious now. Whatever voltage had been running through her when Holloway went down had shut off the moment she was secured. Her face was slack. Her body wasn't shivering as hard as it should have been. Holloway crouched next to him and said, very quietly, "She's not a civilian." It wasn't a question. Callahan looked at the rifle still locked in her arms, at the way her right hand had curled around the stock even in unconsciousness, thumb outside the trigger guard, index finger indexed along the frame, textbook safe hold position. "No," he said, "she's not." He reached toward the rifle. He stopped himself before he touched it. Something about the way she'd locked Holloway's wrist made him pause. He looked at her face instead. "Why do you still have it?" he thought. 3 days in that water, and you never let it go. The helicopter turned northeast. Below them, the debris fragment that had kept her alive disappeared under a gray swell and didn't resurface. The medical assessment at Reykjavik Air Station Naval Annex took 2 hours. Dr. Pamela Ostrovsky had been the base flight surgeon for 4 years, and she had processed more hypothermia cases than she cared to remember. Fishermen, pilots, twice, rescue swimmers who'd stayed in the water too long. She knew what 3 days of North Atlantic exposure did to a human body, and she knew it intimately. What she was looking at on the examination table did not match. "Dehydration is severe," she told Callahan. "Approximately 48 hours without fluid intake based on the markers. Some limited caloric burn evidence suggests she was moving intermittently, not just lying there." She paused, reviewing the chart on her tablet. Tissue damage consistent with extended cold exposure, but significantly less than expected for 72 hours. Her insulation response is, she stopped. "Is what?" Callahan said. "Anomalous." Ostrowski set the tablet down, her body suppressed shivering. That's not a good thing. Under normal circumstances, shivering generates heat, and suppressing it usually means the thermoregulatory system has shut down. But her core temp didn't follow that pattern. She stayed at 33.4 Celsius when she should have been in cardiac arrest range. A beat. That's not something that happens randomly. Trained response? Not exactly. You can't train yourself to change core temperature management, but you can. She hesitated again. There are programs. Cold water survival conditioning, SARE level and beyond. Sustained exposure protocols over years. The body adapts. It doesn't adapt this much, not naturally, but with structured intervention. She looked at the woman through the observation window. I don't know what she went through to be built this way, but she was built this way deliberately. Callahan said nothing. The rifle had been placed in a locked equipment locker under Callahan's personal key code. He'd done it himself, over Holloway's suggestion that they hand it to Base Armory. He wasn't ready for anyone else to touch it yet. He looked at the woman through the window. Her name was not in any database he'd run. He'd pulled the queries himself, biometrics from the medical team, facial recognition through 3 separate systems, fingerprint cross-referenced against DoD, FBI, Interpol, and 2 partner agencies he wasn't going to name in writing. Everything came back empty. Not redacted, not classified access restricted. Empty, as in, no file existed. That meant one of 2 things. Either she was someone who had never been processed by any governmental system anywhere in the developed world, which was essentially impossible for someone who moved like she did, or she was someone whose file had been deleted. Deletion wasn't hard, if you had the right access. It was expensive, and it left traces if you knew where to look. Callahan knew where to look. He'd found nothing. He thought about the 3 days. The distress beacon had pinged once, from a vessel registered as a chartered research support craft operating out of Tromsø. The ping had lasted 11 seconds before cutting off. After that, nothing, no mayday, no follow-up signal, no contact from the charter company, which had listed the vessel as overdue but seemed disinclined to escalate. Callahan had noted that and filed it. The vessel's registry, false. He'd checked within the first hour. The company listed as owner didn't exist. The port of record had no documentation of the vessel's departure. So she'd been on a ghost ship. That ship had been destroyed. Satellite imagery of the grid showed debris patterns consistent with rapid catastrophic hull failure, not weather. Something had happened to that vessel, something sudden and violent, and she had ended up in the water. With her rifle. She had survived 3 days. She had not sent a distress signal. She had not inflated a survival raft, though the debris field included components of at least one. She had found a piece of hull plating and she had held on to it, and she had held on to the rifle, and she had waited. Not for rescue. She hadn't flagged their helicopter. She'd waited for something else. Or she'd simply refused to die until it was over. Marsh knocked on the observation window and held up his chart. Her vitals were stabilizing. She'd be conscious within a few hours. Callahan turned back to the equipment locker. He wasn't going to wait a few hours. The locker room was empty. Callahan set the rifle on the examination table under the fluorescent light and took his first real look at it. His background was not technical. He was a mission commander, not an armorer. But he had handled weapons his entire adult life, and he knew, within the first 30 seconds, that what he was looking at was not standard anything. He called in Petty Officer 2nd Class Dennis Farquhar, who was the team's weapons specialist and who had, in a previous life before the Navy, worked 2 years at a private defense contractor that Callahan wasn't cleared to know the name of. Farquhar walked in, looked at the rifle, and didn't say anything for a long time. "Well," he finally said, "talk to me." Farquhar pulled on examination gloves and began the assessment with the careful, almost tender attention of someone handling something they didn't entirely trust. "Receiver is custom, not based on any commercial or military platform I recognize. The machining is..." He turned it slightly under the light. "This is not factory work. This is bespoke. Someone with access to very high-end CNC equipment and very good metallurgy knowledge built this from scratch." "Which someone?" "I have no idea." He kept moving. "Barrel is fluted, minimum 30 inches. Threaded for a suppressor that isn't here. Rifling twist." He checked the muzzle without disturbing the action. 1 in 8. Not standard for a long-range platform. Someone tuned this specifically. He reached the scope mount and stopped. The scope is gone. It's been removed cleanly. There are mount marks, dovetail rail, non-NATO spec, but whatever was on here was taken off. Recently, the metal's not weathered. Before she went in the water. Probably. He kept going. Then he found the module. There. It was integrated into the underside of the stock, just forward of the pistol grip. Not bolted on, not retrofitted built in. Roughly the size and shape of a deck of cards. Matte black, with a microport that accepted a non-standard data connector. "That's not a standard component," Farquhar said. "I can see that. I mean..." He looked up. "I've heard of data logging systems for long-range platforms. They exist. Military R&D. Some private development. They record atmospheric conditions, shot data, ballistic coefficients, used for training or for mission documentation." He looked back at the module. "But this is not any variant of any system I've seen or heard of. This is custom built for this specific weapon. Can you access it?" Farquhar looked at him. "I'd need an adapter made. The port is non-standard." "How long?" Farquhar checked his watch. 3 hours. "Maybe 2. 2, Callahan said. Farquhar worked. Callahan stood in the doorway and watched the fluorescent light catch the receiver of the rifle. No serial number anywhere on the weapon he'd looked, and Farquhar had confirmed. Not removed, not filed off, simply never stamped. A weapon built to be invisible. He thought about the woman and her pale blue eyes and the 2 seconds she'd looked at Holloway before deciding he wasn't a threat. "Who trained you?" he thought. "Who built you, and this thing you won't let go of?" The fluorescent light hummed. Nobody answered. Farquhar had the adapter built in 90 minutes. By then, Callahan had called in Holloway, and Voss and Marsh, everyone who had been on the helicopter, everyone who was already inside whatever this was becoming. He didn't brief them. He just told them to be in the equipment room at 1800 hours. They were. Farquhar connected the adapter to a secured laptop, air-gapped, no network connection, base security protocol, and ran the read sequence. The module had encryption on the data partition. Farquhar broke it in 17 minutes using a brute force sequence and his private toolkit, which he had definitely not built during his time at the unnamed contractor. The data loaded. It was organized in shot logs. Each log contained a timestamp, GPS coordinates of the shooter's position, atmospheric data, wind speed at multiple altitudes, temperature gradient, barometric pressure, humidity, and a hit confirmation signal. 17 logs total, spanning a period of approximately 14 months. Farquhar scrolled through them in silence. Everyone read over his shoulder or watched from the sides. The room was quiet except for the hum of the equipment and the faint sound of the base wind outside. The 16th log was the most recent. Farquhar stopped scrolling. The atmospheric data was extreme Arctic conditions, wind shear readings that would have made any normal long-range shot essentially impossible. Temperature at -14 Celsius. Wind speed at the shooter's position averaging 31 kilometers per hour with gusts to 48. The hit confirmation signal was present and positive. He scrolled to the distance field. The number read 4,112 meters. No one said anything. Voss leaned in closer. Check the unit. Meters, not feet. He leaned back. Holloway said, very quietly, "That's not possible." "The data says it is," Farquhar said. His voice was neutral in the way that voices go neutral when the mind is working too hard to put inflection in. "The verified world record for a confirmed sniper kill is approximately 3,540 meters, Callahan said. He'd looked it up on his phone in the past 90 minutes while Farquhar worked. That was Canadian Armed Forces, 2017. It took 3 shots. This, he looked at the hit confirmation field. This is logged as a single round engagement. 1 shot, Holloway said. 1 shot. The room was silent again. Marsh, the youngest one there, 26 years old, who had seen considerable darkness in his time as a Navy corpsman, said, "Who was the target?" Farquhar was already scrolling to the target data field. It was encrypted separately, with a different key. He worked on it for another 11 minutes while everyone waited without speaking. The target field resolved. A name, a designation, a set of coordinates that corresponded to a location in northern Scandinavia. Callahan read it twice. He didn't say it out loud. He turned and looked at the wall for a moment, processing, and then he turned back. "Is this authenticated?" he said. "The data signature is consistent throughout," Farquhar said. "I can't verify against an external database without a network connection, but everything internal is clean. No signs of manipulation. So it's real. It's real." Callahan straightened up. He looked at each person in the room, one at a time. "This conversation doesn't happen outside this room until I say so. You understand that?" Nobody argued. He looked back at the screen, at the name in the target field, at the distance, 4,112 meters, at the single hit confirmation marker, clean and unambiguous, like a period at the end of a sentence. Not luck, not an accident, not something that happened in the chaos of a firefight. Calculation. Perfect, impossible calculation. He thought about the woman in the medical bay, unconscious, her body having performed the function it had been built for, and now doing what bodies do when the adrenaline stops. Shutting down, repairing, waiting. You knew exactly what you were doing, he thought. Every degree of every variable. And you still hit it. He closed the laptop. The name in the data file was Harold Stennett. Callahan knew the name. Most people in certain operational circles knew it, though in the way that you know the name of a deep-sea geological feature, technically aware of its existence, rarely required to think about it in practical terms. Stennett was old money and older connections. A private defense systems developer whose companies existed at the intersection of government contracts and areas of activity that didn't appear in public records. He was, at various times, described as a consultant, an investor, a strategic advisor. He was, in practice, someone who had access to programs that the official chain of command neither confirmed nor managed. He was, as of 72 hours ago, dead. Callahan had found the initial report in the intelligence summary, a brief notation, sourced from a Scandinavian partner agency, describing the death of a private individual at a remote research facility in northern Norway. Cause listed as unconfirmed. Investigation ongoing. No further details. No further details, because no one was sure what had happened. The facility was remote. The personnel had evacuated. The body had been found by a private security team that had declined to cooperate with the Norwegian authorities and had, within hours, removed the body and disappeared. Now Callahan knew what had happened. He sat alone in the equipment room after the others had gone, and he thought about what it meant. The woman had fired from 4,112 meters somewhere offshore, probably from a vessel or from a coastal elevation point, and had hit a target inside what was presumably a secure facility. The security detail around a man like Stennett would have been substantial. The facility itself would have been designed with protection in mind. Every roofline and ridgeline within conventional engagement range swept and monitored. Approach vectors accounted for. The security team would have completed their checklists, confirmed their perimeter, and considered the problem solved. None of it had mattered at 4,112 meters. At that distance, there was no protective detail. There were no walls. There was only physics, and whoever had learned to make those calculations with the cold precision of a machine. He thought about the other 16 logs in the data file. 16 other engagements, 16 other targets, their names encrypted in the same partition, spanning 14 months. He did the mathematics. Roughly one engagement every 26 days. Not rapid, not frantic. The measured, unhurried cadence of someone who planned extensively before acting and did not hurry the planning. He had decrypted Stennett's name because it was the most recent file and Farquhar had prioritized it. The others were still locked. He left them locked, for now, because names carried weight, and he wasn't ready to carry more than he already had. The question was not what she had done. The data was clear on that. The question was why, and more immediately, who was looking for her, and how close they were. Because someone had destroyed that vessel. Someone had known where she was, or had tracked her, or had been positioned well in advance. She had ended up in the water, not by accident, but because someone with operational resources and clear intent had made that happen. Not a reactive move, a contingency. Someone had anticipated the shot would be taken, had mapped the probable escape corridors, and had placed an asset. She had survived 3 days of what that asset was meant to make certain. She had held the rifle. They had assumed the water would finish the job. They were wrong. And they did not yet know that they were wrong, which created a window. Brief. Closing. He looked at the locked laptop and thought about the other 16 names sealed inside it, each one a room in a building he was now standing in the middle of. He thought about the woman in the medical bay and the 2 seconds it had taken her to evaluate Holloway as non-threatening, about the grip that hadn't loosened in 3 days of open ocean. Then he went to her. She was sitting up when he walked in, not lying down, not propped up sitting, both feet on the floor despite the IV line in her left arm, her back straight, her hands in her lap. She was wearing the base's standard issue patient clothing, and she looked, Callahan thought, like someone who was wearing a costume. Like the clothing didn't fit her properly, not in terms of size but in terms of category. She turned her head when he walked in, evaluated him in roughly the same 2-second interval she'd used on Holloway, reached a conclusion, returned her gaze to the middle distance. "Where is my rifle?" she said. Her voice was low and controlled. No waver from the cold, no roughness from dehydration, though both should have been present. She'd either recovered faster than anyone should have, or she was managing her presentation. Callahan pulled a chair and sat down, putting himself at eye level. "Secure storage. It's safe." "I didn't ask if it was safe. It's in my personal custody. No one has accessed it without authorization." He paused. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Derek Callahan. My team pulled you out of the water this morning." She looked at him again. Longer this time. "I know. What's your name?" A pause. Short, less than a second but present. "Claire." Just the one name. He let it sit. "Claire," he said, "can you tell me what happened to the vessel?" "It was destroyed." "By who?" "People who didn't want what I was carrying to reach its destination." "The rifle." She didn't confirm or deny. She looked at him with pale eyes that were doing something he couldn't entirely read, calculating, yes, but also something more patient than calculation. Waiting, like a long-range shooter waiting for the wind to settle. "You accessed the data module," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Then you know what I was doing." "I know one part of it, the most recent entry." He held her gaze. 4,112 meters, Claire. Against a fixed target in a hardened facility. In those atmospheric conditions, she said nothing. "The record," Callahan said carefully, "is 3,540. Records exist to be recalculated," she said. Flat, not boastful, factual, in the way you might describe a mathematical constant. Stennett had a full protective detail. "At standard distances, a protective detail is an obstacle," she said. "At 4,112 meters, a protective detail is decoration." Callahan sat back slightly. He'd interviewed a lot of people in his career, prisoners, witnesses, assets, personnel under investigation. He had a calibrated sense for the internal state underneath the external presentation. Fear, guilt, defiance, calculation, he could usually read the mixture. He couldn't read this one clearly. What he got from her was something closer to stillness. Not the stillness of someone suppressing emotion. The stillness of someone who had already processed everything that was happening and was now simply waiting for the next piece of information to arrive. "You're not registered anywhere," he said. "No file, no record." "That's not an accident." "No," she said again. "Someone deleted you." She looked at him, a very faint shift in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite something else, something like that. He leaned forward. "What I need to understand, Claire, what I need you to help me understand is who destroyed that vessel, and whether they know you survived." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, she said, "They know." The room was quiet. "How long do we have?" he said. "Less than you'd like," she said. "More than you think." She reached up and, with careful deliberation, adjusted the IV line where it had kinked against her arm. Her hands were steady. Her face was steady. Everything about her was steady in a way that Callahan found, for the first time in this entire encounter, genuinely unsettling. Not because she was dangerous. He'd been around dangerous people. Because she wasn't worried, and people who understood the situation as clearly as she did, and who weren't worried, were either reckless or prepared. She didn't strike him as reckless. The story came out in pieces, not volunteered, extracted, carefully, over 2 hours, with Callahan asking the right questions and Claire answering them in the narrowest terms possible. She had grown up in the system. Foster care, group homes, the standard machinery of institutional childhood. She had tested well, exceptionally well on spatial reasoning and pattern recognition from early on, and those tests had been noted, and noting them had set in motion a sequence of referrals and evaluations that had, by the time she was 15, resulted in her enrollment in a program that did not officially exist. The program had various internal designations over its operational life. She didn't name them. What it did was take young people with exceptional aptitude profiles and build them into precision assets, long-range engagement specialists, in the vocabulary she used. The training had begun with mathematics, ballistics, atmospheric physics, probability calculation, then physical conditioning, then fieldcraft, then finally, weapons. She had been 17 when she first fired at distance, 21 when she was first deployed. By 23, her data logs, the ones now sitting in Callahan's secured laptop, began. "Who ran the program?" Callahan asked. "It had multiple overseers over time," she said. Stennett was one of them. The room shifted slightly, not physically, but in the way rooms shift when a piece of information connects to another piece and the whole structure changes shape. "He funded it," she said. "In part, he also used it. The program took contracts not through official channels, private engagements. The assets generated revenue, and the revenue sustained the program. You were contracted out. We were directed," she said. "The word choice was deliberate. We didn't negotiate contracts. We received mission parameters. And you complied." She looked at him without expression. For a time, he asked the question carefully. "What changed?" Her hands, still in her lap, didn't move. "I was given a mission parameter that I refused to execute. The target was not what I had been told." He waited. "The program told its assets that our engagements served a purpose, that the targets were legitimate threats, arms dealers, bad actors operating outside oversight, the kind of targets that conventional operations couldn't reach." She paused. "Some of them were, early on." Another pause. "Later, the criteria changed. The program evolved into something else. The targets became inconveniences rather than threats." Inconveniences to who? To the people who funded the program and used it to manage their interests. Callahan thought about Stennett, about the other 16 names locked in the data partition. He thought about what 14 months of engagements looked like if you mapped them against the private financial and defense interests of the people in those files. "The mission you refused," he said. "What was it?" "An academic researcher," she said. "Based in Finland. No connection to any defense application. No threat profile. She had published findings about procurement irregularities in a private defense program." A pause. "She had 2 children." The room was quiet. "I refused the mission," Claire said, "and I disappeared. As much as anyone disappears when the people looking for them have the resources the program had. She looked at him. It took me 8 months to locate Stennett specifically, to establish his role in the procurement network and document it, to prepare. The other 16, Callahan said, are documented in the logs, she said. Each one has a file, not just the shot data evidence files, financial records, correspondence, the documentation of what each of them did and directed. She paused. The module doesn't just contain shot logs. The encrypted partition has everything. Callahan looked at the wall for a moment. You were building a record, he said. I was building accountability, she said, quietly, without drama. A record that couldn't be sealed or classified or buried, that couldn't disappear the way I disappeared. A pause. The shot logs authenticate the evidence files. If the shot is verified, the documentation attached to it carries weight it wouldn't have otherwise. He thought about that, about the elegant, terrible logic of it. She hadn't been on a killing operation. She'd been on an evidence operation using the irrefutable physics of confirmed long-range kills as cryptographic signatures for a chain of documentation that no one could dismiss. Who were you bringing it to? He said. Someone who can't be reached through normal channels, she said. Someone who isn't part of any of the networks these people control. He thought about who that might be. In a world where the people in those files had the access and resources they'd apparently had, the list of genuinely independent recipients was very short. The vessel, he said. Someone found out where you were going. Someone in the network recognized the pattern. I'd been careful, but a slight pause. I'd been in the water before they could sanitize the location. They assumed the cold would handle the rest. And instead, you held on for 3 days. She looked at him. I had reasons to hold on. He stood up slowly. He looked at her, the steady hands, the controlled face, the pale eyes that were still, somehow, patient. Still waiting for the next piece of information. The people who destroyed that vessel, he said. They'll have assets in this region. We need to move you. I know. You're going to have to trust my team. She considered that. For longer than any of the previous pauses. Then, your corpsman. When I was hypothermic, he adjusted the warming protocol based on my core temp pattern rather than using the standard algorithm. Callahan blinked. That's yes. Marsh noticed the anomaly and adjusted. That's good judgment, she said. Correct judgment under uncertainty. She looked at him steadily. I trust correct judgment. It wasn't warmth, exactly. But it was something. Get dressed, he said. We move in 40 minutes. They moved her to a secondary facility, a small building at the edge of the base perimeter, used for equipment storage, now hastily converted to a secure position. Callahan's team set up a defensive perimeter with the resources available to them, which were not inconsiderable, and Farquhar worked on decrypting the remaining 17 evidence files, while Voss ran communication security. Callahan sat with Claire for 2 hours while the work happened around them. He asked her to explain the shot. She was quiet for a moment. Then she began. At 4,112 meters, she said, the bullet is in the air for approximately 7 seconds. In that time, every environmental variable continues to change. Wind direction, wind speed at multiple altitudes through the trajectory path, not just at the firing position. Temperature gradient, the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation, which at that distance deflects the round by roughly 1.5 meters, depending on the latitude and bearing. That's a lot to calculate. It's a system, she said. Every variable interacts with every other variable. You don't calculate them sequentially, you build a model. You understand the system as a whole, and you find the state in which the system allows the shot. She paused. The weather that day was bad. Most observers would have said the shot was impossible, but the variables were consistent bad in a predictable way. Consistent turbulence is calculable, random calm is harder. You waited for the right moment. I waited 11 hours, she said. On position, in those conditions. The window lasted 14 seconds. Callahan said nothing for a moment. He thought about 11 hours prone in Arctic weather, in the kind of conditions that had nearly killed her after 3 days of passive exposure. The facility Stennett was in, he said. How did you know where he'd be? Pattern analysis. Stennett had routines, not obvious ones, but consistent under behavioral analysis. 14 months of data collection. He moved to that facility twice a year, always in the same weather window, always within a 6-day range. I was in position before he arrived. You waited for him to come to you. I calculated where he would be, she said, at what time, within what margin of uncertainty, and I positioned myself at the only point in the geography where a shot was physically possible. She paused. The shot itself was the easy part. Callahan looked at her. The preparation, she said, was the work. He thought about that. He thought about 14 months, about 17 targets, about an 8-month gap between refusal and first engagement, 8 months of building the evidence, establishing the documentation architecture, creating the authenticated record. When you say easy, he said, I mean it required execution of a known process, she said, not improvisation. Everything that could be anticipated had been anticipated. When the window came, the decision tree had been reduced to a single branch. He nodded slowly. The vessel afterward. I was 40 nautical miles offshore before the security team found the position, she said. They found the position because I let them find it. I needed the time signature to be clean, for the data to be time-stamped against a confirmed location. By then, I was en route, and someone tracked the vessel. Someone tracked the vessel, she confirmed. Faster than I expected. There's an asset in the transit corridor I hadn't identified. That's a pause. That's the only thing I got wrong. They hit you at sea. Explosives in the hull. Timed device they'd gotten someone aboard during a refueling stop, apparently. I had less than 30 seconds. She looked at her hands. I got the rifle, and I got into the water, and I stayed alive. For 3 days. The cold is manageable, she said, in the tone of someone describing a moderate inconvenience. You learn to move through it rather than fight it. The physiological response becomes a tool rather than an obstacle. Callahan thought about what kind of training produced that response to nearly dying from exposure. Stennett, he said. Specifically, tell me what he did. She told him. She described it in the same quiet, flat voice she used for everything else. Stennett's operation had run for more than a decade, using the program that had built her and others like her. Not just as a precision tool, but as leverage. The program had produced documented evidence of its own engagements as insurance, each asset's work creating mutual assured destruction between the participants and the funders. No one could expose anyone else without exposing themselves. Except the assets themselves, who had never agreed to the leverage arrangement, who had never been told. He used what we did, she said, to build a cage around the network. Everything we documented became evidence against us, not against them. We were the exposed ones. A pause. Until the documentation was reversed. Until the evidence was authenticated in a way that couldn't be controlled. The black box logs, Callahan said. A confirmed kill from 4,112 meters can't be faked, she said. The physics are publicly verifiable. The atmospheric data is internally consistent and can be cross-referenced against weather station records. The shot exists, it happened, and everything attached to that shot exists with the same certainty. Callahan sat back. He understood now what she'd built. Not a weapon, a key, a method of forcing open a door that had been deliberately welded shut. The people we need to bring this to, he said. I know who they are. Then we need to get you to them alive. She looked at him. For the first time since she'd woken up, something shifted in her expression, not fear, not relief, but something like the settling of a long-held breath. Yes, she said, we do. Farquhar found the signal at 2,300 hours. It came in on a frequency that wasn't assigned to any NATO or partner nation asset in the region, a tight beam directional pulse, the kind used for covert coordination between ground teams. He caught it on a passive scan he'd been running as standard counter-surveillance protocol, and he tracked it for 4 minutes before it went dark. He went directly to Callahan. They're here, he said, or close. Within 30 kilometers. How many signals? One confirmed, possibly more I didn't catch. He handed over the frequency analysis printout. This is professional. This is a team that knows what it's doing. Callahan looked at the data, then at Farquhar, then at the door of the room where Claire was, with Marsh reviewing the evidence files. Options, he said. We can request base security escalation, But that brings in command attention we might not want until we know who's compromised in the chain. Farquhar kept his voice level. We can try to move her off base, but we'd be moving into the field they're watching. Or we stay and we make the position defensible. That's the least mobile option. It's the most controlled. Callahan thought for a moment. They want the rifle and the data. Not necessarily her, they'd prefer to retire her cleanly. But what they absolutely need is the module, which means they'll try to get it before they try to finish the engagement. Which means they'll try to infiltrate before they try to assault. He looked at Voss. Lock down the equipment room. Physical locks, secondary layer. If anyone breaches, I want noise before entry. Voss moved. Callahan went to Claire. She was already standing when he entered, her jacket on, the IV removed. She'd taken it out herself, the needle port capped neatly. She was looking at the small window at the north wall of the room. "You heard," he said. "I didn't need to hear," she said. "How long ago did they arrive?" "Signal first detected about 40 minutes ago. Probably in position for an hour before that." 2 hours, she said. "They're patient. That means they're good." "My team is good." She looked at him, not doubtfully, just with the same calibrating attention, measuring what she was working with. "I need the rifle," she said. Callahan thought about that for 3 seconds. "You're not in a condition." "I'm in the condition I'm in," she said, "which is better than it looks." He thought about her heart rate at 48. About Ostrovsky's puzzled face when she described how the body managed cold in ways it shouldn't be able to. He thought about 11 hours prone in Arctic weather. "You can have it," he said, "but we're not going offensive. We're holding position and creating time." "Time for what?" "Farquhar has the evidence files decrypted. I've already sent a compressed packet to a contact in a partner agency, someone clean, someone outside this network's reach. If we can hold for 4 hours, that packet gets into hands that can't be pressured or disappeared." She looked at him. Something changed in her expression again the second time in 2 hours. Something that wasn't quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. "You moved without me telling you to," she said. "It's my operation," he said. "I don't wait for permission to do my job." A pause. Then, quietly, "Good." She held out her hand. He went and got the rifle. The contact was a federal prosecutor named Douglas Haynes, based in Washington, but presently, by coincidence or by fate, in Brussels for a treaty negotiation. Callahan had worked with Haynes once before on a case involving private military contracting irregularities, a case that had gone further than expected and had, quietly, produced outcomes that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Callahan trusted him because he had watched him be threatened and hold, which was the only real test. He had made the call at 2, 3, 4, 7 hours, standing outside the secondary facility in the Arctic dark, his breath visible in the cold air. He had used a civilian satellite phone, his own, registered to a personal account, not a base asset, and he had kept the transmission to 3 minutes. Just the file transfer protocol and 2 sentences to confirm the content. Haynes had asked one question and Callahan had answered it, and they had both understood that the answer changed the scope of what they were dealing with. Haynes had said, "Get her somewhere stable." Callahan had said, "Working on it." Then he'd gone back inside and told his team what was coming. Haynes received the compressed packet at 0047 hours and confirmed receipt at 0103 hours. By 0311, the infiltration team had tried twice to breach the equipment room and had been turned back both times without contact. Voss and Holloway were very good at what they did, and the base geography channeled the approach in ways that favored the defenders. The first attempt had come from the service corridor on the building's north face. Voss had detected the approach by acoustic signature and repositioned before contact. The second attempt, 28 minutes later, had come from the roof access, less expected, more professionally executed. Holloway had been waiting for exactly that. He did not explain afterward how he had known. He didn't need to. At 0315, the signal went dark. By 0400, the perimeter was clean. They were gone. Not defeated, withdrawn, purposefully, cleanly, the way a professional team withdraws when the mission parameters have changed and continuing the operation is no longer rational. Someone had told them to stand down. Someone had done the calculation. The data is transmitted, The recipient is documented. Retrieval no longer neutralizes the exposure, and had reached the correct conclusion that escalation now created more liability than it solved. The network was contracting, not breaking, contracting, drawing inward, assessing, beginning the slow process of cutting loose everything that could be cut loose. That process would take time. And time was now, finally, on the other side of the equation. Callahan sat in the equipment room with the secured laptop and the decrypted evidence files, and the quiet that comes after a night of sustained alertness when the body finally allows the mind to catch up. His coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. Claire came in at 0430 and sat across from him. She set the rifle on the table between them. "It's done," she said. "The files are in Haynes's hands. He'll take it from here." Callahan looked at her. "The other 16? All of them?" "Fully documented. Each one. It will take time. Cases like this take time," she agreed. "I know. I've been patient before." He looked at the rifle, at the module integrated into the stock, at the data partition that had carried, inside it, 17 authenticated kill logs and 17 evidence files, a chain of documentation that a network of powerful and careful people had believed was safely beyond reach. They had built walls around it. They had deleted the people who generated it. They had sunk the vessel carrying it into 40 meters of iron-gray water. And here it was on a table in a storage building on a NATO base, waiting for a federal prosecutor in Brussels to begin reading. "Farquhar found something when he was doing the final decryption run," Callahan said. She looked at him. "There's a second partition in the module," he said. "Beneath the evidence files, a deeper layer." She was very still. "He didn't crack it yet," Callahan said. "It's a different encryption architecture, more complex. He estimates another few days." He paused. "Do you know what's in it?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "Is it more evidence? More targets?" She looked at him. The pale eyes, the steady hands, the extraordinary stillness. 4,112 meters was not the longest shot in the logs, she said. Callahan felt something shift in the room. The data showed. The data showed the 17th engagement, she said. The most recent, the one attached to Stennet. She paused. The second partition contains the full log. All engagements, including the ones from before I started the documentation project. He processed that. How many more? She didn't answer directly. The network is larger than 17 people, she said, and I have been doing this for longer than 14 months. The room was very quiet. The second partition, he said carefully. Is it also evidence? Documentation? Yes, she said. Authenticated. Complete. He thought about the scale of what she was describing. About a network large enough to require more than 17 years of carefully authenticated documentation. About the infrastructure required to sustain that, the patience, the precision, the absolute solitary focus. He thought about an 8-year-old in a group home somewhere who had tested well on spatial reasoning. About what had been done with that child, and what that child had done with what she was given. The second partition, he said, is the documentation enough to... Yes, she said. It's enough to end it, all of it. He sat back. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the woman who had built, over years in the cold and the silence, an irrefutable record, not just of violence, but of accountability, who had turned the weapon pointed at her into the mechanism of its own destruction. Who else knows about the second partition, he said. No one, she said, until now. She looked at him across the rifle on the table between them. Outside, the Arctic dawn was beginning a thin gray line at the horizon, light arriving reluctantly, the way it does in high latitudes, as if it had been debating whether the world deserved it. What do you need from me? He said. She considered. Time, cover, and a reliable contact at The Hague. He nodded slowly. He thought about what this was, what it had become since the moment Holloway had looked at the shape in the water and said she's breathing. He thought about the choices that had accumulated since then, each one small and reasonable, each one bringing him further into something enormous. He didn't regret any of them. I can get you to The Hague, he said. She nodded. Once. Stood up. She picked up the rifle and held it at her side, not with effort, but with the ease of something that had become part of her center of gravity. She walked to the door, paused. "Callahan," she said. He looked up. 4,112 meters, she said. "In the logs, in the record that Haynes has now, it isn't the longest shot." He held her gaze. "Not even close," she said quietly. And she walked out into the gray Arctic morning, into the thin, cold light, moving with the absolute economy of someone who had calculated every variable and was already preparing for the next. The rifle was in her hand. The horizon was ahead. It was, she had said, only the beginning. She had meant it.